Good evening and welcome to the first in ACS's Fall Book Talk series, a discussion of the book No More Police, A Case for Abolition by Mariame Kaba, and our guest for tonight's book talk, Andrea Ritchie. I'm Christopher Wright DeRocher, and I serve as Vice President of Policy and Program at ACS, the country's foremost progressive legal network with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. ACS's mission is to shape legal debate, nurture the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensure the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. If you aren't already, I'd encourage you to become a member of ACS. Go to acslaw.org where you can join and find more information about events like this one and see the complete list of books on our fall reading list. I'd also encourage you to follow ACS on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. Some quick housekeeping notes before we begin. This evening's discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be available on ACS's website after today's program concludes. There will also be time during today's discussion for audience questions. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please do not use the chat to ask your question, as we will not be monitoring it, and your question will not be put in the queue. Now, I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome Andrea to discuss her book this evening. Andrea Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant survivor, a police misconduct attorney, and organizer who has been documenting, organizing, advocating, litigating, and agitating around policing and criminalization of Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people for the past 3 decades. She is the author and co-author of several books in addition to No More Police, and the co-founder of the Interrupting Criminalization initiative with Mariame Kaba, as well as the In Our Names Network, a network of over 20 organizations working to end police violence against Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people. She currently hosts the Invest, Divest learning communities at the Community Resource Hub and supports dozens of organizations across the US working to divest from policing and invest in community safety. In a slight programming change due to illness, Andrea will be discussing her book with Dean Spade, the Wismer Professor for Gender and Diversity at Seattle University School of Law, where he teaches administrative law, poverty law, gender and law, policing and imprisonment, professional responsibility, and law and social movements. Professor Spade has been working to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. There's so much more I could say about these two incredibly accomplished people and their work, but like me, I imagine you're eager to hear from them directly. And so with a huge thank you for stepping in at the last moment, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Professor Spade.
Thank you. I'm actually going to take us in first to thank Professor Spade also for joining us, but also to thank you, Christopher, and the American Constitution Society for hosting this event. I'm really grateful and excited to be in conversation with you and your membership, and grateful for the opportunity and hope that folks will find it enlightening and helpful. I wanted to jump in because I wanted to sort of introduce Dean a little bit from my angle and why even though I'm very sad Angelica is not here with us tonight and sending her and her family lots of healing energy, why I'm excited that Dean graciously agreed to jump in. And one reason is because Dean and I think are celebrating our 20-year friendiversary, comrade-iversary this year. We met around this time in 2002, and so much of what's in No More Police is shaped by not only Dean's scholarship and thinking and brilliance, but also the journey that we've been on together, and particularly the chapter that I really want us to think most around tonight, which is the reform chapter, because it's the chapter that sort of thinks most about the question that Christopher opened us with, which is, how do we use the law as a force of good and not as something that's continuing to bolster and re-entrench and expand and deepen the influence of violence in all its forms, including the violence of policing and prisons and punishment and criminalization, exile, and so on. So we have been kind of on this journey together for 20 years, thinking about how could we try and use the law? And Dean is one of the most creative legal minds I know. He's one of the people who knows the law the best that I know, and is always trying to think creatively about how to use it. And that we've thought together, particularly around how we might use the law to reduce the harm of police interactions with LGBT people. And certainly in this moment where we're thinking about the criminalization and denial of healthcare and just gender affirming care, but also healthcare and the right to exist to trans people, we've been thinking about it. Are there ways to take away the tools for that kind of violence and criminalization against queer and trans people, both by police, by prisons, by administrative systems, by medical professionals and others? And so I wanted to sort of invite us to start there, Dean. You wrote a fantastic book called Normal Life that folks should read, sort of chronicling that journey, but just it's one that you and I have been on since in 2004, I guess. I sued the New York City Police Department with my co-counsel, Rose Weber and Joey Mogul, to try and change the way they interacted with trans people, particularly in how they sort of assigned and sort of regulated people according to gender as they move through the system. And prior to that, and what sort of led to that case, was doing criminal defense for people who were identified to the organization you founded, Sylvia Rivera Law Project, as protesters who had been arrested during the 2004 Republican National Convention. So we were doing protest defense, we were doing legal observing, and then when folks came out and sort of told horrifying stories about what happened to them while they were locked up, we were filing lawsuits and trying to figure out how to change the policy and practice of policing. So 20 years later, how would you assess the success of that journey, and then one that followed where we came together at a national level to try and think at a federal policy level, what could we do to reduce harms of policing and punishment and criminalization against LGBT people? So what's the assessment coming out of that around reform, and whether there's any possibility of reform of policing, whether it's about queer and trans people or anyone else?
I love that this is your book talk and suddenly you're like on the spot. Wait, what's going on here? Filling in for Angelica. Yeah, I mean, well, I think this is why I rely on your work so heavily, because there is like literally no one who I think has helped me think this through in as much rigorous detail as you. And you put out so much analysis and pragmatic tools. And you have for so long, and through Interrupting Criminalization, this is so very obvious and present. I really encourage everyone who's on this call to look at the Interrupting Criminalization website and just see like the sheer number of reports that are like literally just doing this analysis in very deep ways about specific things. So I think that like, something we share is this like I would say it's a deep learning about the failures of a civil rights frame as the frame for looking at the harms and violence caused to like targeted groups. That like the idea of getting us like these kind of abstract rights in law and saying that like the law sees you as equal, or the law says that discrimination against you is unlawful, and that the cops will theoretically protect you, or that you could theoretically join the workforce, like that these kinds of like legal wins in the realm that has been considered equality law just haven't delivered. And that in the period in which that area of law has developed has been the same period where we've seen like the drastic increase and expansion of prisons and policing and immigration enforcement, and the racial and gendered wealth divides. And so that people like us have been like, there's something wrong with that being the place in law that we look for the kinds of change people need to increase survival. And we've said instead, let's ask a really different set of very pragmatic questions about what are the harms our communities face? Okay, the main ones they faced are law enforcement, every kind of law enforcement, whether that's the family policing system taking your family apart, or whether that's being put in jails or prisons as a kid or as an adult, or whether that's something that's a prison but is under the immigration system, something that's a prison but is under the criminal system, something that's a prison but is a psychiatric facility, like naming that all these things are prisons, and saying, okay, what we're really looking for, like what are the pathways to these kinds of harm and violence for our communities? What would they need to have to not be on those pathways and to get to live longer lives with less violence? And then our legal work is not about these broad declarations of equality that I kind of don't meet, the rubber doesn't meet the road. It's actually about like, how do we dismantle the systems that chew up our people? And that leads us to very pragmatic steps, like let's get less cops on the street through defunding strategies. Let's like take things that are criminalized and decriminalize them anywhere we can. Let's let's reduce like every part of the apparatus that feeds our people into violence and early death. And then like that reframe like generates all these incredibly pragmatic, detailed questions. Like, how do we know if this thing's going to work? Like, if we have this thing we think is a better idea for a reform, like, you know, we got to debate that. Like, is this going to bite us? Is this going to actually turn out? And so I think one of the things when you ask this question, what's happened over the 20 years that we've known each other, one thing is just a lot of experimenting, like a lot of like, oh, if we try this, actually we have an opposition and they pick it up. Like they'll pick up our terms, they'll pick up, you know, and I think so much of your work and so much of abolitionist thought generally is about noticing like, oh, if we complain about the system in these ways, the system will come back and they'll put like rainbow flags on cop cars. Be like, look, now the cops aren't homophobic, even though the cops are doing the same things they were. Or they will offer us softer policing methods, or they'll offer us new ways of imprisoning people through, you know, home imprisonment, they'll offer us hiring more kinds of cops, like just noticing what the counter moves are to our critiques and trying to design immediate pragmatic steps that are less vulnerable to becoming tools for our opposition. So I think that's how I think about that. But I would love to hear I'd love to hear how you think about that, because this is, I think, the thing I rely on so much in your work is incredibly detailed, research-based, careful thinking about these like difficult questions that also include speculation about what our opposition will do.
I mean, I'm so grateful to you for laying that out. And I think that the journey that we've been on has like led us to that conclusion. And what we do in the reform chapter of No More Police, and actually the chapter is the word reform is spelled re-form at Mariame, my co-author's insistence, because what we've learned, and Mariame, I include Mariame in this, in our efforts to reshape or address the system, or like you say, use tools to reduce the harms that our communities are experiencing, is that more often than not, the system will just reform itself. Like reform is literally like, we're going to recreate the same thing in a slightly different form. And that's what we learned. You and I, you know, as part of this lawsuit that we filed against the NYPD, got the most sweeping changes to literally, we went through the entire patrol guide of the New York City Police Department page by page and crossed things out and rewrote things and negotiated over 18 months. And what came out was the most progressive policy at the time in the country around how cops should engage with trans and gender nonconforming people. On paper, we had achieved the win. We achieved what my client wanted. My client wanted, in all caps and bright red letters, you can't search someone to assign them a gender. Folks studying the Constitution, there's 3 reasons you can search someone: weapons, evidence, and contraband, not anatomical body parts. And using those to assign for gender is not permitted by the Constitution. And so we got that written really clearly in the policy book. And so we won in the way that Dean is saying. We won something that is a legal win. And I was getting calls from, and you were getting calls, and we were still getting calls from people who were experiencing exactly the same kind of treatment after the policy had been passed. And similarly, I got a call once from a Black trans woman who was telling me about how she had been strip searched to assign her gender after being profiled and arrested. And she kept saying to me she was with her husband. And I was like, okay, great. Making a note, being like, oh, witness, whatever. I'll interview him. And she kept saying over and over, I was with my husband. I was like, yes, I got you. I got his name. I'll talk to him. And she was like, no, like my for real legal husband. And I realized what she was saying is the point that you made earlier, is that we had achieved the legal equality such that as a trans woman, she had a legal husband, and his presence and the presence of their legal equality and their legal marriage didn't stop the violence that we had also tried to fight through this policy change. So in the reform chapter, we talk about how both of us have fallen prey to the lure of reform. And I think that you and I don't know that we fell prey to it necessarily, but we were trying to make it work to reduce the immediate harms while we fought for a different future. And I think each time we found that the system does what it's set up to do. And if the system is set up to sort people by gender, it's going to keep doing that. And no matter how it does it, it's going to continue to enact violence in doing it. And so trying to make policy change, trying to stew our way out of, I mean, my client got a settlement, she went on to live her life. Other clients, I've won many settlements for clients who have had the similar experiences. And yet there is always another one behind them. There's always 10 more behind them, because the purpose of policing, among people know that policing is about policing the lines of race, of policing the lines of poverty. It's also about policing the lines of gender, as is becoming more and more apparent through this legislation that's coming across the country. And I think we really tried. I think that's the part that feels important about particularly the reform chapter of the book, is that it outlines the ways Mariame and I both originally thought reform was the way to go and have fallen for it a couple of times. And each time it's failed. And you and I have experimented with all the things. We've pulled out all the Section 1983 stops. You were an expert witness in my case. We won, we set precedent around, how when lawyers are expert witnesses, what can happen with the underlying materials, like we did all the lawyer things. And you and I worked really hard at the lawyer things. And we found exactly what this chapter says, which is that we're just reforming the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that there aren't some legislative and legal strategies that we can use that can actually help us achieve a larger goal of not reforming, but dismantling and rebuilding something new, that is not policing in a new form. And we'll get to that in a second, but I think it really was important for us to really detail in this chapter, not only kind of the long history of reform failure, like we've been trying to reform police since they were started. And there's been, every commission has come with the same recommendations. You could read them from 1800s, 1900s, 2000s, same recommendations. Sometimes we try and look to technological fixes that are new, but the same thing kind of happens and the same results. And then we're back in the washing machine with the next killing, the next set of racially discriminatory statistics, the next sexual assault by a cop, the next incident that reminds us that we haven't fixed it. So we look at that long history, but then we also look at our own history. And so that's why it felt important to talk about, to let you all know that we weren't coming here from an abstract theoretical place of saying that why we're abolitionists and why we feel like that's the way that we're going to end the violence that our communities face. We're coming to it from having really tried it. And I know neither you nor I went to law school thinking that we were going to find justice in the law. We were clear about, we were going there to learn more about the systems that oppress us and how to dismantle them and how to reduce the suffering that they impart in the present. And still, we kept trying to use the tools. And you're continuing to teach law students how to use the tools, and also how to recognize when using the tools isn't going to work. So I know there's some particular pitfalls of reform that you have talked about, and I'm curious if there's any that you want to share, and then I can talk about some that we talk about in this chapter, and then move on to how do we figure out the thing that's not going to be, that's going to be a helpful reform.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say like that. I think one of the things we're always struggling with is how to make sure a reform isn't changing what the law says about itself, and also just noticing what things are, like policing isn't changeable through changing the rules about what police do, because they're totally lawless. They're just like that. They are designed to have widespread illegitimate authority and use it for violence. And so I think like our efforts to change the rules on the books about what cops could do to trans people in terms of, sexually assaulting us when they arrest us under the guise of placing us correctly, was a hard won lesson of like, oh, people have changed the rules of what the cops can do a zillion times. And the cops, you can be like, no, don't do that chokehold. And they'll just do that. And you can be like, don't shoot people for no reason. And they just do it. And like, we just know that. So I'm just trying to do also like these kind of deep, pragmatic, historical material assessments of what kinds of things do make change. And then you're always experimenting. You're like, oh, if we defund the cops in this way, will there be less cops on the street? Will they find some other way? Like just that is like, sometimes we don't know. And also sometimes our opposition has new moves. But yeah, in terms of this, for many, many years, I've used kind of like 4 questions to have this conversation about assessing reforms. And part of this is that I emerged, as a scholar, organizer, activist in a period where like trans stuff was first mainstreaming in the 90s, not mainstreaming like it is today, but there was a new wave of trans organizing. And there was this question, like, should trans people kind of like seek out the same reforms of law that have been the main popular gay and lesbian rights reforms? And my argument was no, they won't get us what we want, for a lot of reasons, because of the failures of that kind of civil rights framing that I mentioned before, and because trans people are so incredibly poor and marginalized and criminalized and targeted that they especially won't get anything. If those kind of reforms get anything for anyone, they get it for like the least oppressed of the targeted group. So anyway, the 4 questions that I have used historically are like about whether a reform is a good idea is like, first, will it get any material relief? Because so many reforms are just like, we have declared that our state loves these people, or doesn't want people to kill them. But there's nothing behind that. Like, it's just like, I always think about this moment when Trump was elected and there was a lot of liberal hand wringing here in Washington state, and all of our city and county and state like electeds got together and they had this big new press conference saying that they were declaring Washington a hate-free state. And it was just like utter nonsense PR. These are the exact same people who are like at the time building a youth jail we're fighting against, expanding a detention center. Like, they are filled with hate. They are doing things, and they're all sitting on stage being like, we love Muslim people, we love transgender people, but like they're literally making material decisions on the daily that we are opposing that hurt those very communities. So the question is, when any reform is being proposed by electeds or by nonprofits or whoever saying it's the answer to our questions in our dilemmas and our suffering, is this reform going to have material relief? Is anybody going to get housing, get out of jail? Or is it just like kind of surface? The second question is, does the reform leave out a particularly marginalized group? Because one of the key things reforms love to do, I always think about Obama's like moment where he took executive action on immigration as the example, where he made his big speech, we're going to start targeting for deportation felons, not families. And he created DACA and DAPA, these, immigration relief for the people who've been decided are like innocent and it wasn't their fault kind of thing, or associated with those people, like where literally the reforms to get passed, where it increases immigration enforcement for some people, increases money to ICE and DHS, while it gives a little bit of relief for some special people. So anything that does that like is a reform that supposedly offers relief, but it enhances the stigma of the most stigmatized people in our communities. Because of course, if you're going to enhance immigration enforcement against people who he calls felons, that means you're taking who are the communities that are most policed and criminalized. It's going to be Black immigrants, it's going to be poor immigrants, immigrants with disabilities, trans immigrants. All those people are going to be more deportable now because you've decided this other set is less. So we want to avoid reforms that divide our communities in that way, that enhance or reinforce stigmas that already exist and that are going to like make those people's lives even less valued and more targeted because we're saying there's a few good ones, a few good immigrants, a few good whatevers. We always want to avoid reforms that expand or legitimize a system we're trying to dismantle. So, I mean, that's what they love. And I want to talk to you a lot more about this during this conversation, because we see so many of the responses to the 2020 uprising being this. The way systems love to respond to our movement's opposition is to be like, let's hire more cops, but they'll be trans. Let's pass hate crime laws that'll give more money to local police. And then they'll investigate when you get murdered. Like things that either make our opponents look like they're our advocates, like that rainbow flag on that cop car, or when they hire a trans cop or whatever, or things that actually just add to their budgets in the name of solving our problem. We got to say no to those. And then the fourth question I always ask is, does it mobilize the most affected for ongoing struggle? So I'm always asking, is the way that we're trying to win this reform like a bunch of backroom deals between like lawyers and bureaucrats, or is it something that is actually building the capacity of our communities to keep organizing for the next fight and the next fight? Because no individual reform is going to like solve our problems. Like all of our work is inevitably incremental. We want to make sure we're going on increments towards tearing down stuff that's bad for us, like policing and prisons and immigration enforcement. But we also want to make sure that the way we took the steps built our capacity for that kind of power, instead of just building like the expertise of a few, or like like part of what happens is a lot of times when reforms are run through backroom deals, and I've seen this a lot with like administrative reforms trying to fix like little things in the welfare system or the system of ID, the community doesn't even know about it. The clerks who work in the front don't know. Like, if you don't make a big kerfuffle and have people be able to then know, oh no, we're going to go in there and fight for it to actually make it implemented, it's not implemented. Like, so many of the wins that happen in law, whether we're talking about environmental issues or labor, like they don't land in people's lives. Like, people's lives don't change. So how do we fight for things in a way that there's community power backing it, and that we're even more prepared, with more people organized, networked, and skilled up for the next fight? And this is based on my belief that social change happens through organizing tons and tons of ordinary people, not through technocratic change by a few people with, like, JDs or whatever. I'm super curious to hear like how you all, talk about how in the chapter you all, I think, really expand beyond my 4 questions and add a lot that's really helpful, especially in lessons learned from the period we've lived in since the 2020 uprising. You're muted.
I'm really trying to find a quote in here in No More Police from Naomi Murakawa, who talks about this point that you're making about if you that reforms actually end up putting more money into, I found it, into police budgets and giving them more legitimacy and more power. So the reforms that people were calling for around the time of the Ferguson uprising, including body cameras, resulted in $43 million more going into police departments than would have otherwise gone into them, right? And into the coffers of the private companies that make body cameras. And as we've seen, a cop can literally be staring into a camera while kneeling on a Black man's neck for 9 minutes and it didn't stop the killing. And we've seen so many other things on body cameras happen that they didn't stop. But what we did do is we did put more money and legitimacy into police departments, and we increased the profits of Taser or Axon, which makes body cameras, and tasers. So we have actually not changed the material conditions other than to improve them for police and give them more money and more weaponry and more power over us. And also, in doing that, we have decreased the material conditions of our communities because we've robbed them of those $43 million, which could have gone to housing people who are unhoused, to providing healthcare for people who have unmet mental health needs, to providing all the things that we need as communities to be safe and to be thriving. And instead we poured them into a corporation and into police departments. So I feel like that is a system we learn over and over and over again. And I think the other thing we learned from 2020 is, Derek Chauvin had all of that. He had the de-escalation training. He was taught to not do exactly what he did. And all of the sort of gold standard reforms that the DOJ and other places had been sort of promoting as like how to do constitutional policing, how to do, guardian policing, not whatever the other one is, the other model they have, but to be guardians, not abusers or whatever. All of that was a ton of money, and there's a whole cottage industry around that. And you and I at various times went to the White House to advocate for some of those things that we thought would at least would reduce harm again. And again, all that meant was a lot of money got spent, a lot of paper got written, and a lot of the same happened. And so I think we just kept talking about that over and over again. I think so it puts more money and more legitimacy into policing and corporations and technology sometimes, including increased surveillance technology, and it takes more money away from the things we need to survive. It also, as you said, takes the wind out of movements, right? If you can demobilize people into a backroom policy fight, then you have taken the wind out of the movement, right? And you've made it such that people feel less empowered because they feel like the lawyers will solve it, and so I'll just wait for that. And that's not actually how change is made. And so I think we saw that a lot around when we did the policy change that I was just talking about in New York City, where people were in the streets, people were SRLP and other people were organizing around strip searches and gender searches of trans people. And then once I was in a room negotiating with them for 3-4 hours a month with 4 other people, including one member of the trans community, then we were in that room and it was just the four of us, and we did our best to have community meetings and feedback and be like, they've proposed this, we said that, blah, blah, blah. But it really takes effort to make a legal policy strategy one that is still engaging to people. I think defund as a strategy was successful in that way because it was about everyone getting into a conversation about how we spend our resources and everyone getting into a conversation about what actually is necessary to make our communities safer and thrive more. And so it was a successful way to move that through budget and policy. But there was a way in which things got sucked into a budget fight and kind of taken out of the larger mobilization.
Can I say something about that?
Yes, and then I'm going to come back to this material relief thing because I think there's a thing about police settlements that I have to say, but go ahead.
I want you to say that. I just think that's really interesting what you just said about, like, also, how do we deal with the fact, this is like a big question for us, is like, how do we deal with the fact that like a lot of the stuff we're trying to move is very technocratic? So like the budget fights, the police budget fights, the effort to defund the police in all of our cities, like those fights are coming out of like this very grassroots, street organizing approach that's very powerful, very much like move people out of the disempowerment of like expecting like that lawyers or nonprofits are going to solve their problems, and instead people are in the streets together. And then it becomes, and one of the things it becomes is a budget fight. And it's really hard to keep people as interested in some of the technical details of that. And I think in a lot of cities, people did a really good job being like, come out to the city council today. And, like do like a lot of different kinds of organizing that kept that at people's strategy. But a lot of it is just actually highly technical. And to me, it's like, we can't really blame ourselves for that. That is actually just the nature of how our city governments are designed to not be participatory. Like they are really, really, really not of or by or for the people that live in the cities. They are for the Chamber of Commerce and like the real estate interests and like the cops. And like there's so many barriers to participating in them. And I just think this is a very interesting question for us, because some people would say that our defund things are similarly taking some of the wind out of the sails of something that needs to be primarily fought in the streets. I lean on I personally feel like the defund fights are really, really, really vital because they're so material and they're so like grounded, and they really show, what our cities are operating to do, which is fund police and not housing and other things that are essential to people. But yeah, I'm just curious, like, how do you hold the complexity, that dilemma of like the fact that some things are so technocratic, are so like based on a certain skill set that is disproportionately with certain kinds of professionals? Just like, yeah, I just would love to hear more on that. And then back to the other thing too.
No, and this is something I learned so much from you too, right? And this is something that is a real danger to us as who are lawyers or other kinds of specialists, right? We all want to feel special. We all want to feel like we have special skills that we can offer and that like we're the expert on something and I got this, I can go do this, whatever. And that's not actually how we get free. If we're going to try and change a whole system that is operating to the disadvantage of the vast majority of people, including the people who think they're benefiting from it, it's not going to be the work of a dozen people who are really smart. And I've fallen prey to that too. I think sometimes I'm like, well, I'm a pretty good advocate. I know how to string a sentence together. I can make some pretty compelling arguments. I can be persuasive. Maybe I can just go in and handle it, with a couple of other people. And the point is, it's not about making the best argument or coming up with the best story or the most compelling way of saying it. It's actually about contending for power, and that requires a lot of people. And so because that's the one thing we have more of than them. We have more people than they do, and that can make a difference, as we saw in 2020. And so I think keeping people engaged and keeping people engaged at the point of that doesn't privilege expertise and technocraticness, whether it's about a legal strategy or a policy strategy or a budget strategy, but that keeps bringing it back. So, and similarly, like we kept bringing it back, people being like, they're saying that they want to do this with the policy. I'm gonna break down what that would look like in a day-to-day interaction. We're gonna role play what their proposal would look like, and we'll very quickly realize that their proposal is more of the same, right? Or we're going to do some participatory budgeting. We're going to come up with a people's budget. We're going to have a people's movement assembly that talks about the resources that we have and that we need and how we should be allocated. People did things where they would have giant piles of kidney beans, right? And like they would be proportional to the millions in the city budget, and kids would be able to move the kidney beans around and be like, more kidney beans here for playgrounds, less for police. And so we have to resist the urge to feel special and extra smart with our special skills, right? And we have to be really invested in making sure that all of us can participate in whatever it is that we're doing. Even if we go in the courtroom, we make our arguments, that we're immediately outside explaining to people what happened, getting feedback, getting information, and then going back in and doing what we've learned. And so I'm always about breaking things down for people and making it that be my skill, right? How can I make it something that's still involving people and participatory? We are going to come to questions. We see that some of you are posing them in the Q&A. Please continue to do that. The two other things I wanted to say about material relief, or one thing I want to say about material relief is there can be a tendency to fixate on legal solutions. And I think we saw that in 2020, right? Where people are like, even if we're thinking about abolishing or defunding or dismantling an institution like policing, we're still looking to legal solutions. So there's a lot of sort of conversation about like, oh, end qualified immunity, or let's try to change who pays for the settlements. You know, let's make it so that individual cops have to pay for the settlements, not taxpayers. Let's tally up how many settlements to people who have been harmed by police and their families have been made by the city, and let's make that the argument and make it so that that money should come straight out of cops' pockets, and you know, or we should end indemnification, or we should all the things, right? And again, we have to look to whether those things are going to produce material relief. By the time qualified immunity comes into play, the person is already dead. The person is already harmed. The person is already had their entire life changed, the entire course of their life changed by an encounter with a cop that criminalized them and locked them up for a very long time, or traumatized them, or kept them out of school, or whatever it is, made them lose their children, made them lose their immigration status. I'm not interested in a solution that is focused entirely after the fact, and that is really is not necessarily going to even ensure a different outcome, right? Because as you said, it's about the law telling stories about itself. It's about saying, if we don't have qualified immunity, then we can make this system more just, even though all we're talking about is what redress we can get after the police have already done the harm. So I want to think about what's going to materially change stopping the harm in the first place. What's going to prevent the harm in the first place? I don't want a registry of cops who have done bad. I want no cops who are doing bad, right? Because who gets on the registry will depend on whether they've been criminally convicted. We know that less than 1% of cops who ever do any harm are ever even prosecuted, and certainly even fewer of them are ever convicted of anything. So the registry won't represent all the cops doing harm. It'll just represent the few exceptions that they held accountable for it, or, you know, who there was a successful civil suit against or something like that. And so that's not actually making material change. Ending qualified immunity isn't making material change. Changing who pays the police settlements also isn't going to make a material change, because it just means the material change, if it makes any, will just be less for the people who have been harmed by police. Because if we are trying to get a settlement that actually compensates someone for the degree of harm they've experienced, cops are very skilled at hiding their assets. They're very skilled at transferring their assets. There's also protections around which assets you can take. You can't take their house. You can't take, you know, and ultimately what that will mean is that people who are harmed by police will get less to no compensation. Whereas if at least when the city is paying for it, we can, the city will have resources to be able to hopefully compensate people for the harm that the city did to them. I don't want to presume that there's going to continue to be harm and therefore continue need for compensation, but as long as there is, I want there to be enough resources to pay the person. Some people talk about individual cops carrying individual liability insurance. As someone who represented workers against private companies for workers' compensation and injuries sustained at work, and anyone here who's ever tried to get an insurance claim covered, whether it's a car or health thing, knows they're motivated by profit. And the best way for them to make profit is to deny every claim. That's their policy. If you haven't watched a civil action, go watch it. That's their policy. Deny, 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 and make you fight for it until you give up. And try and blame everything on you. You didn't injure your arm working the same motion on a line for 30 years. You injured it taking the garbage out last week. You didn't injure, you know, it's not a systemic problem, it's your individual problem. And that's what would happen also if cops carried individual liability insurance. We would be placing people harmed by police at the mercy of private insurance companies who they are not accountable to anyone but their shareholders at least ostensibly, supposedly. Policymakers who currently, compensate people for harm by police are accountable to the public, and that we can at least make some demands on them, put pressure on them. We could protest all day outside Aetna Insurance. They don't give a fuck. So they're really about their profit, and they're gonna use all the criminalizing narratives that cops use and more to say that people aren't entitled to compensation. And of course, those of you who study tort law know that also they are governed by assumption of risk law, which means that they're going to say something like, if Eric Garner's out there selling Lucy's and trying to break up fights, he assumed the risk that a cop might kill him, right? And that's the kind of law that they'll be under if we're moving to private insurance. So I want us to think about these material impacts, particularly when we're looking to the law for solutions where they are false solutions, or they're solutions that are actually going to harm the people that we think we should be helping. So that's sort of another way of thinking that through. I want to share an Interrupting Criminalization tool that folks can use. I can't actually share it to everyone, so I'm going to send it to you and make sure, Grace, that make sure that it goes out. Thank you. And so that definitely is a toolkit that offers kind of charts and graphs and things that you can help use to try and ascertain whether the reform that you're pursuing is actually going to help us get closer to what we're looking for, and it includes the questions that Dean asks and many, many more. And at the end of the reform chapter, No More Police, we also sort of describe a process that organizers in Chicago went through to think about which reforms to pursue in 2014 and 2015, guided by my co-author Mariame, using some of these questions to think about, which reforms to pursue and which not to. Before we move to this question around courts and then open it up to questions, I do want to say there are ways that we can use the law to advance these goals, and you'll see some of them in that toolkit, and also in the reform chapter of No More Police, and in the world. Like Angelica Chasaro, who couldn't be here tonight, was really brilliant in terms of how she did use the law to advance the goals of movements to defund police in 2020. Thinking about how to anticipate what the police would do to resist defund, calls to defund, and moving resources out of policing into community safety, and legislating to intervene to stop that, to make sure that the policy goals that the campaigns were advancing would actually be actualized. And I agree with you, Dean, that then that means you have to stay on top of it. They had to form a whole working group called Defend the Defund to make sure that those rules were being followed, and that all the kind of safeguards and bumper lanes they'd put in place were there. But I do want to name that part of the reason I had asked her to share is that there were ways in which they were using the law to achieve the goals, and that's still possible. And one of the ways also that they were doing that was also by targeting the process of criminalization itself, because ultimately that's what underlies policing and punishment, and where we need to be targeting our attention. And part of that had to do with focusing on the courts. So
people are having trouble with the link, the organizing toolkit link. Can they just find that on the Interrupting Criminalization website?
They can. Thank you for finding that.
Yeah. I know we should go to the audience questions, but just one thing that I just see, just because of the particular audience we might have for this event as an American Constitution Society event, one of the things I think is the most interesting that you have worked on and are thinking about is actually like closing courts and abolishing courts. And I think there's a really interesting difference, like the idea of defunding police or even ending police in prisons is a much more popularized idea than the idea of defunding or ending courts. And I would love it if you just talk a bit about that and about what that work looks like and what that thinking looks like and where anybody's working on that. I just think that's a really, just like really transformative idea.
I think, the website where we sort of explore some of these ideas are here. And yeah, it is a little mind-blowing to folks, right? To be like, oh yeah, sure, we can imagine defunding and abolishing police, we can imagine defunding and abolishing prisons, maybe ICE, etc. But courts, I mean, courts are just how we do things, right? And so we really invited people on this website to think about, is it how we need to do things? And, you know, that those are the kind of the machinery that takes people off the street, kidnaps them, and moves them into a system. And whether it's a prison or a detention center or a group home or a locked psych ward, courts are moving people into some form of surveillance, containment, control, and coercion as they're currently structured. And so if we're trying to get rid of those things, then we don't just get rid of the frontline people, and we don't just get rid of the back end, but we get rid of the middle machine. So there's many similar tools there that help folks discern which kind of reforms of courts are going to continue the violence and harm that they perpetrate, and which are going to dismantle them. And then I really encourage people to check out the Imagine section, because we really want to think about, like, what purposes do we think courts have to serve? Do we need an investigative function when harm or conflict or disagreement occurs? Do we need an adjudication function? Who should be engaged in that? How should engage in that? Because even if we get to the world that we're fighting for, people are still going to harm each other because we're humans. We make mistakes. Sometimes we have urges that are not aligned with our values, but we do what we do. And that we need ways of navigating those things. And we need to think about what those might look like that are more aligned with our vision. So people are working to similarly shrink resources to courts. They're working to shrink the harms that courts do, and they're working to imagine how to pull people out of kind of the machinery that courts suck them into. And there's lots of ways that people can get involved. So I encourage people to check that out, because I think, and maybe even there's some law professors who are trying to think about how to integrate this into their criminal procedure or civil procedure classes, and certainly invite you to share these with your professors and encourage that kind of, or if you're doing a class project and you're thinking about, you know, a way of provoking the conversation, there might be some tools there for you. So.
Thank you, Andrea. I wonder if you want to address this question from ISIS in the Q&A. How does the prison and police abolitionist movement intersect with Indigenous rights to have land returned and sovereignty materially restored?
I really encourage you to read a beautiful book called Rehearsals for Living by Robin Maynard and Leanne Betamasake Simpson, which is just a gorgeous exploration of these questions. But the summary of it, and when you go to the No More Police website, you'll see there's some posters there and postcards that you can get to benefit survivors of police violence and their families that have their words on them. But basically what they're saying is that the way to end policing is land back, and land back as a prerequisite to ending settler colonial racial capitalist structures on Turtle Island, and those are the things that require and perpetuate policing. So there's a really beautiful discussion between them. But I think the best, from my perspective, I'm curious about yours, Dean, from my perspective, the best parts of abolitionist movements are engaging with questions of Indigenous sovereignty and land back. And I think the organizing in Seattle, where you are, Dean, is one really good example, where the Seattle Solidarity budget has demands specifically targeted to the sovereignty, you know, to redirecting resources towards the sovereignty of the Duwamish peoples. And I hope to see more and more organizing that's doing that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's just so clear that Indigenous people are targets of every kind of policing, and also immigration enforcement, right? The borders are arbitrary places around each of our countries, and that Indigenous resistance has been met intensively with law enforcement violence. And so, like, the policing and imprisonment systems in the US are colonial systems. You know, like they're central to maintaining this colonial framework that we live under. And I also feel that you know, I agree with you that, like, the best work on police abolition, prison abolition, immigration enforcement abolition in the US is internationalist work that is like deeply tied to like global questions about Indigenous sovereignty that involve what's happening here in the places that are currently under the rule of the US government and also beyond. And that kind of like any deep, effective prison and policing abolition movement has to be like anti-imperialist, anti-war, anti-colonial. Like that feels so central. There's another question in the Q&A that I think is really useful about how we respond to the backlash and the cowardice of electeds who are fighting to show how pro-police they are. This is a question I wanted to ask you, Andrea, just like to talk a bit more about like kind of this moment. Some people have called it a moment of counterinsurgency. Just this moment, like 2020 was a big deal. And there was people really made a lot of trouble. And there's been a number of responses from elected officials, I mean, and also from corporations and nonprofits and all kinds of things. But I'm just curious if you would just talk in broad strokes about, or specific examples about what you've seen, what you think our counter moves are to their counter moves, just, yeah, like how you're experiencing, because you are really on the front lines of that work.
I'm trying to think of a succinct answer, given how much time we have, but, you know, my co-author, Mariame Kaba, you know, talks that it's not just a backlash, it's a front lash, right? It's a constant drumbeat of everything requires more and more and more and more and more policing, punishment, exclusion, surveillance, restriction, etc. And it's, as Dean was saying, like in 2020, the police experienced the most powerful challenge to their legitimacy, I would say, in a generation. And so they reach for their most reliable tools, the ones they always use, which is fear and violence and threats. And we talk in the book about police being kind of a protection racket, right? The truth is you can never achieve absolute safety. Abolitionists care very much about safety. We quote, or I often quote Aaron Miles Cloud of Movement for Family Power, who says, you know, everyone cares about someone's safety somewhere, some of the time. Abolitionists care about everyone's safety everywhere, all of the time. So we are absolutely trying to think about how to, and many of the folks leading abolitionist movements are survivors of violence who have found no safety or more violence in the current response, or deprivation, right? Or I didn't have housing that I needed to escape a situation because the cops took 50, 60% of the budget, right? Or, you know, people are finding that the vast majority of survivors don't call the cops. When they do, they experience harm. They're afraid to experience harm again. They don't experience the safety they're seeking, and the cops are taking all the resources for the things they need to be safe. So there's definitely people who are trying to think about safety, and we're also pushing back in the book against the notion of safety as something absolute, that's like a product that can be sold to you, right? And that you can buy perfect safety. I mean, we live on a planet that's hurtling through the universe. Like uncertainty is just part of the human condition, right? But the state keeps trying to sell you safety, and then when it doesn't appear, it says, well, you need to give us more money, and you need to give us more power, and you need to give us more legitimacy. And then we give them all that, and then they're like, and we're still not safe, and they're like, oh, well, then you just need to give us more money and more power, more legitimacy. It's like this protection racket. And so I think the question about how you respond to the front lash is recognize that it's the protection racket and keep calling it out as the protection racket, and recognize that it is actually a function of the power of the work that you've done. Like the President of the United States, the State of the Union address is a very tightly scripted talk because there's a lot of issues to cover in a very short period of time. The fact that the president felt like he had to respond to the demand to defund police in the State of the Union address is the testament to the power of our demand. The fact that politicians currently continue to like obsess about and continue to feel like they have to speak to, undermine, and fight back against demands to defund or divest from policing or reduce the scope of policing or reduce the scope of criminalization or reallocate resources is because of the power of the demand and the power of the organizing behind it and the power of the demand, the vision that the demand represents, which is a society where everyone has what they need to be safe without having to, you know, invest in something that can be a little bit like Russian roulette, depending on who's calling for help and when and why. And so I think I'm not saying there's nothing demoralizing or devastating about the backlash. I too feel demoralized and devastated by, the constant sort of refunding of policing and defunding of libraries and schools and things people need and youth programs. It's very disheartening. And also we are making an impact, and movements are in waves, right? And Dean and I were fighting many of these battles for 20 years. And there were many periods during that time where we were making no progress or feeling like we were constantly falling back. But we just kept going. We just kept fighting. We just kept trying. We kept experimenting. Does this work? Does this make things better? Does this work? Does this make things better? Oh, there's an opportunity here. Let's jump in and see if making federal policy around this is helpful. Oh, no, actually not helpful. Okay, back now over here. What are we doing? And even in the things that we were saying about federal policy, the demands we were making were defund demands. We were like, defund this, fund this, and continuing to think about these things. And then it's that ongoing work and ground laying and building with people that makes moments like 2020 possible. And then we jumped through that portal. We pushed the conversation forward more than many of us thought in our lifetime would be possible. And now we're facing the pushback, and we are pushing forward back. And I think, just in closing, I think it was, a fortuitous timing, I guess, that the day that, the current president announced that he was going to pour, $1.3 billion more dollars into policing and put 100,000 more cops on the street, that a book came out that said, no, we have a different vision. We have a different answer. And right now we're fighting. There's two clearly different visions of the world. One in which diminishing resources and the impacts of climate catastrophe and racial capitalism as it collapses will be increasingly and more violently policed, and the lines around who gets to get access to diminishing resources will be increasingly violently policed, and misery and defunding of public good will increase. And one in which we fight against that, and we say we want abundance, safety, as much as we can create, well-being, and care and community for all of us. And that means we need to defund the institutions that are in the way of that, and fund and fight for the institutions that promote that. And I think that's where, as lawyers, we have to figure out how we get in when we fit in, which means not necessarily not looking to the law for the answers, looking to the law for strategic, tactical moments that we can do things, but making sure that we're using those checklists to make sure that we're not inadvertently contributing to the thing that we think we want to fight. I don't know if you have
Thank you.
any of that, Dean, in 2 minutes.
I just want to say this book is such an incredible offering and accomplishment. It has so much wisdom from so many experiments that you and Mariame have been involved in for so many years, boiled down to be so understandable, so useful, both the deep philosophical questions and the what are people trying? How do you do it? What are the contradictions? What's complicated? How do we navigate them? It is just, something that I will be rereading and teaching, I'm sure, for the rest of my life. It's just as every single thing you make is. And I just am so grateful to you and grateful to the American Constitution Society for lifting up this work, which I really would love to just see more and more people who are tussling with the law trying out thinking in this way. So thank you so much for this event, and thanks for hosting us to the American Constitution Society.
Thank you so much. And also for being here on short notice for this conversation. I'm always so excited to be in any conversation with you, and want to make sure that folks also know that there is a study and discussion guide. Again, a tool for, your local, Student Lawyers Guild chapter, or your discussion group among your progressive lawyers in your community, or your movement lawyer group, or whatever it is that you're thinking about. You can find it here, and it has, questions, things you can research, things you can dream about, things you can practice. Not all of them are directly applicable to the law, but they're all directly applicable to all of you as people who want to see and make a better world. So I hope it's helpful. And again, thanks, Christopher and the American Constitution Society for hosting us tonight.